Everyone, my name is Hannah Olson, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Disclo. I am super excited about today's conversation because this is really a topic that comes up for us almost every day at Disclo. Every company that we speak with really does come to us having a different process when it comes to accommodations. At some companies, I say that managers are directed to send employees straight to HR, whereas others are having managers involved throughout the interactive process. They're providing input on things like essential job duties or whether or not a proposed accommodation will actually work on the floor. So just to be clear, I'm not here today to tell you how you should or shouldn't involve managers at your company. I'm really here to go through EEOC recommendations. I'm going to walk through some examples of common missteps that we see with managers. And I'm going to give you some sample language that you can pass off to managers on your team. So hopefully we'll all be leaving the conversation feeling better equipped to educate managers on their role in the accommodations process. So without further ado, really quickly, for those of you who are new to Disclo, I'm only going to spend a minute here covering who we are. But I myself am someone who lived with a chronic health condition and required accommodations at work. When I first entered the workplace out of college, I was actually hooked up to IV antibiotics for 8 hours a day, which I administered while working full-time in the office. And so inevitably, I saw firsthand from the employee's perspective really how uncomfortable it can be to ask for support at work. So when we started working in the disability space now almost a decade ago, we were honestly baffled by the fact that while technology has transformed nearly every aspect of HR and compliance, companies were still really approaching accommodations in a very ad hoc manner. More often than not, we heard from companies who were, hacking together these internal processes with spreadsheets and shared drives and ticketing systems that really weren't designed for the nuance of accommodations. And so we built Disclo really to be the system of record for accommodations, helping companies manage the end-to-end process all the way from intake through resolution. I'm going to start with a moment that might sound familiar to you. I want you to picture, it's a Tuesday afternoon and a manager at your company is wrapping up a regular one-on-one. And the employee's halfway out the door, and almost as an afterthought, they say something along the lines of, I've been struggling a lot lately and sitting on the open floor has been really difficult for me to focus. And, I don't know, maybe I just need to push through it. That's it. That is the entire thing. There's no form. There's no formal, I'd like to request an accommodation. And there's certainly no mention of the ADA. This is an example of just a person who's saying something hard on their way out the door. And what that manager does in the next 90 seconds will shape whether this becomes a supported employee and a clean process, or whether or not it's a confused employee, a missing paper trail, and a problem that's going to land on HR's desk 3 weeks later, much bigger and much messier. This is something we hear all too often. And I like to say that the accommodations process really doesn't begin when a request hits an HR inbox. It begins the moment that an employee says something to the person that they trust most at work. And as you probably know, that person is almost never you as HR. It's usually the employee's manager. We like to say that managers are the front door, but unfortunately, most of them have never been trained on what to do when someone actually knocks on that door. So we're always training managers on things like performance reviews, on giving feedback, on running a team, but we rarely train them on the conversation that I think carries the most legal and human weight of it all. And I'd say that this is not just my view or Disclo's view. If you read any compliance literature right now, the headline is pretty much the same, that ADA compliance starts with managers, not HR, because the most important decisions often get made before HR is ever even involved in the process. So today's not going to be about turning our managers into employment lawyers. It's really about giving them a role that they can get right every single time and giving you the language to be able to teach them that role. This is the part that should, put everyone in the room on alert. So the moment a manager hears that an employee is struggling for a reason that's tied to a health condition or a pregnancy, disability, or even a religious practice, the clock can start. So when a manager gets the next 90 seconds wrong, the consequences don't just land on the manager. Of course, it lands on the company. So that's the whole reason that an untrained manager really isn't just an HR headache, it's open legal exposure. And just want to note before we go any further, I will say that I'm going to talk a bit about the law today, but I have to, of course, give the disclaimer that I am not a licensed attorney, and none of this is legal advice about your specific situation. So when in doubt, please consult your employment counsel, but I will be touching upon the law a bit there. So I want to start by showing you why this matters right now with numbers that I can actually stand behind. As you all probably know, the EEOC has certainly been very active when it comes to accommodations related cases. And last year, the EEOC recovered over $600 million for American workers. And accommodations are still really a top cause of this litigation. In 2026 already, we've seen a pretty steady flow of accommodations related settlements. And I'd say that overall, we're just continuing to see more requests, we're seeing more charges, more enforcement, and your managers are still the first point of contact for all of it. I want to go through a few specific cases from over the years, all very different monetary amounts and, of course, periods of time. But I think all of these are examples of either the manager made a misstep or manager training ended up being specifically part of their conciliation process, which to me is a signal from the EEOC that managers need to be up to speed on this. The first case here is an older one back from 2019 against Walmart. This is one that's stuck in my head personally for a very long time because it just seems pretty crazy to me. This was an employee who'd been working at Walmart for 16 years as a cart pusher. He did the job well with the help of a job coach. And to make matters worse, the job coach was actually paid for by the state. So it wasn't even something that Walmart had to shell out any money for. Now, a new store manager arrived and he made the employee resubmit medical paperwork to keep the accommodation that he had already had for years, even though nothing about his condition or circumstance had changed. And so the employee then, him and his legal guardian, then returned the paperwork, and the manager cuts off communication and effectively pushes the employee out. Obviously, this ended up to be a pretty big case, and a jury actually ended up awarding this employee $5.2 million. And I think it's important to sit with the jury's reaction on this because this is how regular people see a manager who is re-verifying for no reason, who's going quiet, and then revoking a working accommodation. We have here, one manager and 3 of the exact mistakes that we're hopefully going to be able to train out through this session. Now, this next case here is an example of a company that has now had to provide anti-discrimination training for all managers as a result of this lawsuit. And I think what's most important on this one is that the EEOC director quoted within their press release, which I have here on the slide, that it's imperative that employers routinely provide updated training to supervisors and other decision makers on equal employment opportunity laws to protect both employees and employers. So this is the EEOC saying directly that this is a training that can't be one time set and forget. And they actually had that as part of the settlement itself. And lastly, while this is a smaller settlement compared to the Walmart case, I think this is another really good example of a new manager that came in with their own biases and took adverse actions against an employee who had been doing their job well with their accommodation in place. And so in this case, the EEOC did require a written warning to the specific manager along with training all new managers. And I think it's important to note here that, managers can be named in these lawsuits, but ultimately, this is another reason why it's so important that our managers are trained on this, because ultimately the company has to pay for the mistake that one manager made. So all of these are pretty clear-cut examples of a manager misstep. They end up in litigation, and then of course, training becomes part of that next step fix. So now that I've scared everyone with the legal risk, let's start to get into the details. And I do want to be clear that for the purposes of today, I'm going to speak a little more generally because I'm well aware of the fact that every company is going to have their own distinct process. Again, at some companies, especially smaller ones, managers may be the front door, but then process might be just directed straight to employee or HR. And then, at larger, more complex organizations, I think we see that managers often play a much more active role in the process, and they don't just hand it off and then reappear at implementation. They might actually be involved in the interactive process itself. And that's because the process runs on exactly what the manager knows, which is, real essential functions, whether the accommodation is going to actually work, what's feasible, et cetera. So I'd say that the most accurate model isn't that managers own the edges and HR owns that untouchable middle, but instead I think it's a bit more nuanced than that, where the manager may be involved to start to finish, but they have a very defined lane in the middle, specifically when it comes to the medical information. So I think the agencies are all pretty aligned that managers can be involved in the process and told what they need to know to be able to implement and maintain the accommodation, but they generally should not be reviewing any medical diagnoses, records, provider notes, or the full medical file, which unfortunately is often the case when employers get that back from a provider. So all of that should live with HR, legal, or a designated accommodations and leave team, and that should be something that the managers are not involved in. So before I get into the actual process itself and where managers step in, I think first and foremost, you need to, of course, define what your process actually is. So many companies come to us and they say, well, we have a process, but then they can't point to an actual written document, which shows, here's who's going to be, who you're sending requests to, here's the response time expectations, et cetera. And so you want to make sure that you get this in writing and make sure that people on your team are aware of what this process actually is. I'd say that so many times accommodations policies just get hidden in a 100-page employee handbook. And then you've got a manager in a meeting with an employee and they start disclosing information or making a request. And then now the manager is having to kind of dig through the handbook and Command F to figure out what the policy is, which is going to be a problem. So this, of course, also can't just be a one-time, here's our policy email. Again, the EEOC said in that last case about ongoing training. So this is the kind of stuff that goes in one ear and out the other. So you have to really bring this up often and make it really clear what your process is to begin with. So now we're going to go into the process itself, and we're going to start with the intake of a request. I'd say that while we like to believe that employees know exactly what to do, we all know that that's just not the reality. As I've said, most employees are going to their manager first, and that's because this is the person that they have the most trust with. I remember back when I was going through this process myself, I certainly had no idea what my rights were. I didn't know how to formally ask for something. I told my manager because I felt like that was the person I knew and they might be able to point me in the right direction. But the problem is most managers sincerely believe that an accommodation request is going to be some kind of formal event. They might think that it's a specific phrase that has to be said, or, we have to get an HR ticket for this to count. I think they're oftentimes just waiting for someone to walk up to them and say, I have a disability that's covered under the ADA and I would like to request a reasonable accommodation. But as we know, that is not how the law works, and it's certainly not how humans work. So an employee doesn't have to say the word accommodation. They don't have to mention the ADA or a pregnancy law or any other statute. And they don't have to put this in writing. So the EEOC says that requests really do require no particular words, that they can be made out loud, and that the obligation begins the moment that request reaches the employee's supervisor or anyone in that general chain of command. So your trained goal really isn't to teach managers the legal definition of an accommodation request. It's to teach your managers that requests are almost always disguised. So I put together a few examples of what requests can sound like. As you'll notice, none of these say accommodation or ADA. If you notice the pattern here, it's limitation plus context. So I'm having trouble with X. That's going to be the limitation. Because of Y is the context that's going to connect that to a protected reason. So when a manager hears a pattern like this, a light should go on in their head. And I think, notice how easy it is to wave one of these off. So the skill that we're building in the managers here is not legal analysis, it's listening. It's being able to catch a pattern, which in this case, a difficulty plus a reason, and that is going to be the cue. So at this point in the process, the manager's job is not to be the fixer. Managers are leaders at your company for a reason because they oftentimes care a lot, and they're good at problem solving. So it's totally normal that the manager might think that, I can just solve this myself with the employee. But there's just so many problems that happen when agreements are made in an ad hoc manner and then they don't go through a formal process. I will touch upon that later. I've got some good examples, but I think the key thing that needs to happen here is that they need to recognize that an employee is either directly or indirectly asking for something, and then they need to loop in the person or the team that handles the process at the company. Again, we're just talking about intake here. So we're going to go through a simple framework. And I think, if your managers are able to do these 4 things in order, they'll almost never get this wrong. Step 1 is really just to listen. It sounds obvious, but it really isn't. So again, I think the instinct under pressure is to immediately try and solve, oh, just work from home on Thursdays. That's no problem. Or on the flip side, it could be to immediately minimize by saying something like, everyone's stressed, you'll be fine. But both of those kinds of reactions skip the human that's in front of you. And so the move here is really to acknowledge and then slow down. The employee just did something that's hard. It might have been a little scary. And so the single best thing that the manager can say is really kind of some version of, thank you for telling me. I want to make sure that you get the support you need. That's it. It signals safety, it buys you time, and it commits to nothing, which is very important at this stage. Next step is to limit. And by that, I want to be clear that limit their role, but not their empathy. And managers can be as warm as they want, but they need to be really, really careful about what they ask and then what they commit to. So a manager who promises an accommodation that HR later can't grant has created just a mess and really a broken trust problem. And then on the flip side, they certainly shouldn't just be outright denying a request, because whether something is an undue hardship is a real determination that nobody should be making in a hallway. So a manager's no can become the company's no when we get to the courtroom, and it's almost never going to hold up. So I'd say that the kind of safe posture here is the middle. I'm not the only person who makes the call on this, but I'm the person who makes sure the right people get on it fast. And again, why it's really important to have a policy so people know, so managers know, like, this is what to expect in terms of turnaround time from HR, et cetera. But really just admitting that I'm not the only person involved, but I have an action step that's going to happen. Next is going to be looping in the right people. So the manager's actual deliverable at this point is really a warm handoff, connecting the person to HR or the accommodations platform that they're using, like a Disclo, and doing it promptly, not just when I get to it, which is something that we see happen. And I think there's 2 common failure modes that happen here. The first is really when you get into that silent black hole where the manager just kind of nods kindly and then doesn't actually do anything. There's no handoff, there's no follow-up. And I asked, but nothing happened is exactly the kind of story that becomes a complaint. So we want to be really careful to avoid that. The second thing that we often see as a failure point is the side deal. I've got another slide on this later, but that's oftentimes when the manager quietly handles it off the books. So the standard that you want is that the employee always knows what's going to happen next and who has it. So an example I put on the slide here is, I'm connecting you with Dana on our team today, and she'll reach out to you by tomorrow. It's specific, it's owned, and it's timed. Now, the last step here is to log. So the manager should be capturing the date. They should be capturing what the employee said in plain terms, any details around the functional limitation, and what the manager did about it. Of course, if they ask for equipment, like a certain piece of equipment, that should also be written down. But they should not be asking about the employee's diagnosis or medical records or writing any of that down. They should also make sure not to include any speculation. This is something we see as a really common failure point where the manager will say something like, I think she's dealing with some kind of anxiety and that's why she's so stressed and not hitting her deadline. So the key is to keep it simple. You just need to document the request, the response, but nothing about the condition, date it, and you're good to go. So I want to make this a little bit more concrete because being supportive but careful is not something that a nervous manager is going to be able to execute at the end of the day on a Friday. So we want to make sure that we're giving them the actual words. On the left here are the keepers. And then on the right, kind of like the no-fly list. At the end of this presentation, I will be sharing a one-pager, so don't feel like you need to rush to write these down or take a picture of it. We'll have to make sure everyone gets that. Now, we're going to get into the interactive process, and I'm not going to spend too much time because this is an area that can be super dependent on the company. But what do managers actually add to the decision? And this is in the case of a company that does really involve managers. It really depends, but it can be a lot. So HR is, of course, owning the actual legal call and running the interactive process, but nobody in HR has done the specific job. So this is what you should be pulling from your managers and really what your managers should know that they're going to be on the hook to contribute to this. So things like the real essential functions, not just a dusty job description, which we all know are usually not the most accurate thing to look at. Or which duties are actually essential versus which ones can we kind of flex, or whether or not the accommodation that they're asking for is going to hold up in that specific work environment. And then, of course, practical examples of alternatives. So this is an area where managers can actually save the company some money. And one of my favorite examples is that an obvious fix on paper might be this very expensive piece of equipment. And so HR isn't working in the mechanic shop, for example. So they're not going to know that there's this $5 wrench that can do the same thing. The manager is going to know that. So that's obviously a faster and cheaper and better fix that only exists because the manager was brought into this conversation. So I think the line stays the same here where HR is leading and driving this. They're the ones, again, holding the medical information and owning the call, but the manager is the one who could help make the call the right one. Now, I realize we're skipping some steps and the accommodations process is much more robust than this. That's on purpose. I'm really just trying to focus on the most important parts that do or can involve the manager. And the next big area is the implementation of an accommodation and then the maintenance of that over time. So once an accommodation is approved, it's not a closed case. I think a lot of people think that approval means we're done. Someone has to actually make it real, and the schedule actually changes, or the coverage has to get arranged, or equipment needs to be ordered and actually used, or the workflow is actually shifting. And that someone is oftentimes the manager. An accommodation that gets approved on paper but not actually happens can itself be a failure to accommodate. So the EOC has some pretty clear guidance on this, and they put the follow-up or the follow-through on the supervisor who grants or owns the request. And they've warned people that without it, the employer is at risk for insufficient follow-through. So all this to say, granted is step one, provided is in part the manager's job. Now, the manager at this point has really become a custodian of private information, and that's a responsibility that they need to take seriously. They're now getting to know the what, the work restrictions, what the person can and can't do right now. They're, of course, not knowing the medical details, but the fact that someone has an accommodation at all is in itself confidential medical information. So something we hear a lot from managers is, what do I do about other people on the team when they ask? Like, what do I do when my coworker says, why does she get to leave early? Or why does he get to have that special chair? the manager shouldn't at this point say that it's an accommodation, because that again can be a disclosure and really can be its own violation, even if nothing else goes wrong in the entire process. And so the EEOC again is pretty explicit about this. And so I want to make sure that you can have a line that your managers can actually use. This will, of course, also be on that one pager, so don't feel like you need to write this down. But a good thing that they could say is something like, we make individual adjustments for all kinds of reasons, and I keep those private the same way that I would for you. That's obviously warm, it's firm, and then it gives away nothing. So I'd say that that's a perfectly in the clear thing that they can say. And then the last piece on the back edge of the request is that an accommodation is not, a piece of furniture that you install once and then forget. Conditions are going to change and jobs change. And what worked in the spring might not work in the fall. So asking something like, is this still working for you, is really a fair and ongoing question. And if that's the case, any change that gets brought up, we've got to route them back through the same door that we did to begin with. So I think a lot of times these just kind of get forgotten. One of the things that we've done at Disclo is we've helped to automate the follow-ups and reminders so that you don't have to sit there and put a calendar reminder to remind yourself to talk with the employee. But if you don't have a system, I think one good way is doing that, putting in calendar invites, and then just making sure that it's not being forgotten after you've gone through this whole process. Now, there are some failure modes, and I think these are mistakes that quietly create the risk. And the most dangerous ones are not, I'd say they're most always never malicious. They're well-meaning managers who are being helpful in exactly the wrong way, unfortunately. And we've already covered most of these throughout the presentation. We've talked about waiting for magic words, or playing doctor and trying to diagnose, or going silent. These are things we've already covered, but I want to spend a little time on two that I think tangle up even the most experienced managers. And that's going to be the kind side deal and the performance collision, which we've briefly touched upon. This is my personal favorite one to talk about because I think it's done out of kindness. I've touched upon this earlier in the presentation, but this is a really common pitfall that we see. And this is what happens when a manager hears something, they hear the need, and then they quietly try to fix it by saying something like, don't worry about HR, I'll just flex your hours, it's fine. This is a trap. And the reason it's a trap is because there's no record. And so if anything's ever questioned down the line, it officially never happened. It's also inconsistent. The manager grants it, and the manager one floor up doesn't. And now you've got two employees with the same need being treated differently, which of course can be a seed of a discrimination claim. But I think more importantly, it can actually short circuit a real accommodation the employee was entitled to, because everyone thinks it's handled. So the line that I think I would give managers is being generous in the moment and being fair across the company are not the same thing, and only one of them protects the employee. So generosity that's documented and consistent, that is the real kind of kindness. Just to drive this point home, I want to talk about an example of how this can go sideways. So I want you to imagine an employee that says that, I'm having trouble working in the office because I'm on a new medication and it's making me nauseous. Now, a manager might informally say something like, work from home for now while HR figures it out. And so the employee starts working from home for a few months, and they at the same time start a formal accommodations process with HR. And then what happens is months later, HR then comes back and maybe they determine that being in person is an essential job function, and they don't allow the employee to keep working remotely. This is a classic example of a manager trying to do the right thing, but creating unnecessary risk in the process. And I think it's just important to realize that a temporary arrangement, it might feel harmless, but it can really affect the employee expectations and the consistency. And then ultimately the company's position later on. It's really hard to go back from once you've said that that's something we can do, because now the employee is going to be there thinking, well, I was working remotely fine, and why suddenly now can't I do that? So we want to really avoid having those kind of side deals and making sure that this always goes through some form of process. Now, the last pitfall that I will talk through is, I'd say, probably the most advanced one, and I assume there'll be some follow-up questions on this. We are going to leave time for a Q&A. I did save this for last for that exact reason, but I'd say that this is where, again, many of the most experienced managers do get the most tangled. And so this is oftentimes, an employee who's been underperforming, and then they suddenly disclose a condition or they request an accommodation, and then the manager kind of panics in one of two directions. They either ignore the request, and their mentality is kind of like, this person's on thin ice anyway. And that's how you turn a performance conversation into a retaliation claim. Or they might just slam the brakes on all accountability, and, I can't address performance now because they have a protected thing. And that's not right either. And it's not fair to the rest of the people on the team. And so, again, the truth lives really in the middle, and it's really a both and, where accommodation requests still needs to get routed and taken seriously, and the track needs to be started. Go, put them through the process with HR. At the same time, legitimate performance expectations don't just disappear. They continue. You've got to keep documenting them and keep that on its own track. There is a legal rule that makes this a little bit more clean, which is accommodation is prospective. So you don't have to erase the performance problems that you legitimately documented before the request. But if they do go through a formal accommodations process and the accommodation gets approved, you do have to accommodate going forward, and you can't let the performance file become the tool that pushes the person out. So past stands and future has to accommodate. So when these two things show up together, this is exactly the kind of moment where we got to loop in HR and not try to handle this ourselves. Even if you feel like you've got it handled, we really want to make sure that everything's getting documented. For those of you who stuck with me for the last 30-something minutes, thank you. I know it's a lot to cover in a short period of time. And I think most people who signed up for this came here today because you saw the event description and you noticed something at your own organization, and you wanted to figure out how you can do a better job in equipping your managers so they can get this right. And I will say that your role matters in this too. And whether you like it or not, you might have to be the line leader here. So I wanted to make it easier for you to start taking action at your company. And so I did put together a one-pager recapping the most important points from today's conversation. I recognize that we're probably all sick of QR codes from the pandemic menus. I certainly am. So someone from my team will be putting this also in the chat. Feel free to duplicate this and edit it and have your own company policies on it, but it's really a starting guide for managers. Get this kind of thing in the hands of your managers. Start having regular ongoing conversations with them. And I think importantly, as another takeaway, is make the routing path single and obvious. The number one reason that managers kind of freelance this is they genuinely don't know what to do and where to send it. So make sure that people know what needs to happen. Set a response time norm, as I said at the beginning. So saying something like loop in has some actual teeth. And please, HR, if you can, role play this in training. I think reading these scripts off a slide and then saying them out loud when it's awkward are completely different skills. And only the second one's going to survive contact with an actual employee. So do this, speak it out. I've had to have uncomfortable conversations in my own job, and practicing them is pretty much the best way to get through it. And then lastly, be sure to audit. The two patterns that I would go looking for are the silent black hole, which are requests that never made it anywhere, and then the side deal, so informal agreements that have no record. Both of these are invisible until they're a problem. So as HR, I would actively look for these. And you might be surprised how many of these actually exist. And, we have heard from customers come and say, we think we have like, I don't know, 5 to 10 requests. And suddenly they go digging and find out that there's all these side agreements being made. And it's actually more like, 100 plus. And so do that auditing. That's the kind of work that you can do on your end. And then just keep bringing this up. Again, these aren't one time conversations. The law is changing quickly. I think that managers, again, have so much on their plate of just people leadership that they forget these things. So you got to keep this as an ongoing discussion. And we do have in July is the anniversary of the ADA. So that's a great time to tie this in. And then October is National Disability Employment Awareness Month ending. That's another great time to have a session on this and make sure that all your managers are participating. So I hope you found this to be helpful. And I now do want to open the floor to any questions. But I do just want to say again, I'm not an attorney, so no legal questions, please. And try to not make them too specific to the organization because I want to make sure that everyone can benefit from the questions. So thank you all. And I will open it up for Q&A. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. Okay, I had a inkling that it may take folks a minute to come up with questions unless there are and I'm not seeing them. I do see a question about whether or not the session was recorded. Yes, recorded, and we will be sending follow-up. We also have a question of should managers be present at the meeting with HR and the employee when discussing the employee's limitations? I think it depends on, again, the company because some companies won't be discussing medical in those kinds of conversations. I'd say that ultimately you should be leaving managers out of anything that involves the medical information because that is where we really want to make sure only the right people have access to that. But if it is a conversation around, on the floor, what are the actual job functions that you need and what are the essential functions in this role and what do you notice about the job environment in the shop versus in the main office? Those are the kinds of conversations to keep them in, but I'd say anything specific to medical to keep them out of. I see another question of do you have a suggestion of an action step that we could take today to get things moving? Yeah, I'd say on my last slide where I put together this resource, that's a really great way to get started is, again, auditing your processes, making sure that you have a policy and practice in place and that's been communicated to your managers and that you are getting this language back to your managers so that they aren't just getting kind of soft advice, that it's really tactical. So hopefully this slide is your takeaway for you as HR to get things moving. I know we've got about 5 minutes left in the Q&A portion, so feel free to keep asking questions. I do have a few questions that I figured may come up after this presentation, so I put a few together, but I will pause doing this as others come through. And for some reason, I can't see Kelly's full question. So this question is, what if the employee already has an accommodation, but then the performance issues come up later? So with this, I think we'd ask, are the performance issues related to the accommodation not working or are they unrelated performance issue? Either way, I would not ignore them. Document the performance concern as objectively as you can and loop in HR and then evaluate whether the accommodation need might need to be revisited. And then I'd say, in general, an accommodation is not a lifetime guarantee that you can't address performance issues with someone, but it does mean that we have to be careful that expectations are really clear and fair and that the employee does have the support that was approved in the first place. Now, question is, what would the situation be what would be a situation where we need to loop legal in? I think it's super company dependent, Erica. That's a great question. We have some customers at Disclo where the buyers were actually the legal teams, and their accommodations team sits within legal. So in those cases, legal is often involved. But I'd say, especially if there's pushback in terms of the approved request or that we're going through the interactive dialogue and employees saying, start saying anything around their rights, that might be a good time to loop legal in. In general, employees today are coming a lot more armed to these conversations, and I attribute that to AI and social media. We now all have employment attorneys in our back pocket with ChatGPT and Claude. And so people are coming to these conversations with that knowledge, and they bring up their rights. And so when an employee starts bringing up those kinds of things, I think that's a good time to get legal in the room just so that you have the protection on your end. Um, and again, with the social media thing, there's millions and millions of posts just from the last few years on social media where employees and attorneys are educating each other on their rights. And so I think in general, we're just seeing them come a lot more armed in these conversations. And so having legal involved is never a bad idea. But I think just depends on the organization. Now it looks like Ashley has a question, but for some reason it doesn't let me see any further up than Erica's. So I'm going to go in the last minute here. This is a common question we see often is, can we still put someone on a PIP if they've requested an accommodation? The answer here, I think, is potentially yes, but this is a high risk moment and one that should be handled with HR and potentially legal, because the PIP should focus on legitimate job related expectations. And then at the same time, the accommodations process should still move forward. So if what they're asking for would affect the employee's ability to meet the PIP requirements, then HR might need to adjust the timelines, the methods, or maybe the expectations around how the work gets done. But they would have to do that without lowering the essential standards. Cool. Are there any other questions from the group? I guess last one I can do then is, can a manager ask, do you need an accommodation? So when an employee, I was thinking about this when I shared the kind of common examples of what employees say when they're first disclosing, which, as we saw, is typically not, I have an accommodation request. It's things like, I'm really struggling to see the board and it's making me dizzy. In this case, managers should ask about work support, but they shouldn't be asking for medical details. So I'd train them to say, is there something you need at work to help with that? Or, would a change to the workspace, schedule, or the tools help you do the job? That language, I'd say, is less intimidating and it keeps the manager out of the medical. And then again, saying like, we have support that exists at the company. If you want to pursue that, I'm happy to connect you with HR. So again, trying to be there as keep the empathy up, keep the support there, but limiting anything related to medical. Awesome. I know we are at time. I appreciate you all being here. Sorry if I didn't get to all the questions. I'll have to look at them after. It was kind of blocking me out on the screen, but we will be sending a recording as well as that follow-up take home. So hopefully this was a helpful session. I think this is a topic that keeps coming up, so we'll probably be doing more of these sessions on this. And our team is always here to support. But yeah, hopefully you all enjoyed and have a great rest of your Wednesday. Thank you.